how much muscle can you gain when you take creatine? That's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. And I've got 4 papers that we're going to use to help break down what the research looks like on this topic. So these are all randomized control trials. The first one, and this is a bit of a theme that you'll see here, they took university-aged people. So this was specifically university students. They were a mix of guys and girls, physically active, but, and this is important, they weren't doing any structured resistance training. And that matters, and I think we need to highlight that and remember that for the other studies as well. So these group of people specifically on the criteria to be part of this study, I think it was within the last 6 months, you mustn't have been doing any resistance training in a structured way. So, you know, you can pick up a weight or whatever, but these people weren't training, I suppose, is the important thing to take from this. So what was their creatine protocol? So they took 0.15 grams per kilogram of body weight, and that was every day. So just to give you some context, if you're looking at a person who's around 70 kilograms, weighs 70 kilograms, we're talking about that's 10 grams of creatine there a day. So that might be a little bit more than most people are expecting, but that's what they took as part of this protocol here. And in terms of their training, obviously that's really important. If we were to just take creatine and not do any training, we wouldn't see any results. So they did 6 weeks, which is pretty consistent, I think, on the other studies as well. They were training 2 to 3 days per week, an upper and lower split, and they were doing 2 to 3 sets of around 10 reps per exercise. So I mean, you know, pretty standard for what we'd expect in a bodybuilding style kind of workouts, really. In terms of the results for this one, what they found was quite interesting actually. So they broke down the muscle gain per muscle group. So they looked at biceps, triceps, hamstrings and quadricep muscle thickness, and they were measuring this, as did I think all the studies we're going to cover today, using ultrasound. So the kind of wand thing that you hold over a muscle. It's used to look at babies in the womb when you're pregnant and they're kind of assessing the baby. You know, that thing with the gel that goes on first. That's what they were using. And they're looking at the thickness of the muscle at one specific area of that muscle. So they will literally measure, so they'll get the imaging, they'll use the ultrasound wand and they'll measure the thickness of the muscle at that specific area that they're looking at. They found that biceps thickness increased, so in both the non-creatine and creatine group. And that's really important to say because we know that resistance training is effective at improving muscle mass. And this was in a group who were not used to resistance training, right? So they're kind of going to get the newbie gains that we would expect. So bicep thickness improved, not as much as it did, so in the non-creatine group, as the creatine group. So the creatine group saw improved bicep thickness of around 16 to 20% thickness. Tricep thickness 26 to 27, hamstring thickness was 10 to 17%, and quadricep thickness was 11 to 12%. And that's compared to the non-creatine group who saw, and they were actually taking, I believe it was a placebo, so it was just like a white powder that looked like creatine, tasted like creatine, probably was something like maltodextrin or something, a carb powder. And they saw thickness improvements of 2 to 6% bicep thickness compared to the 16 to 20% that we saw in the creatine group, and similar with other muscle groups, it was slightly less than the creatine group. So big plus for creatine there. Again, this was a young group of people, not resistance trained, but they saw an improvement compared to placebo. Second paper. So we're moving on now to a paper where they again looked at guys and girls. These were all uni age people again. I don't think specifically they went to university, but it doesn't really matter. They were of that age, so kind of early 20s. And interestingly, these people were training at least 3 times a week already, resistance training. So what you would maybe deem as your typical gym bro or gym girl, these guys were exercising already with weights consistently at least 3 times a week. The creatine protocol for this study was 7 grams a day for someone who's 70 kilograms. So basically they were working on a scale of 0.1 grams per kilogram of body weight. And this was only on training days. So I was a bit perplexed by this, but we'll move on to that. We'll discuss that in a little bit later, but they were only taking the creatine on training days. Fast forward to their training program, they were training 4 days a week. So that means they were only taking creatine 4 times a week. Again, this was a 6-week program, upper and lower split again. So they were kind of working both upper and lower body, 3 sets, 6 to 10 reps per exercise. So again, pretty typical bodybuilding type split that we would see there. In terms of their results, again, we need to go back to the point of these people had already been training prior to this. So the only thing new, so to speak, was a new training program, but they only, they were already training, so it's not really much in terms of stimulus that's new there. But they were obviously taking creatine. That's the change here. But they also had a placebo group, so they were comparing two groups here, and they didn't find any difference in muscle mass. Now, that's not to say that they didn't increase muscle mass. In fact, I think both groups did see an increase in muscle mass over the duration of the study, but there was no difference between placebo and creatine. So far we've got one study that showed a difference, but it was in untrained people. We've got another study here that showed no difference between creatine and placebo in terms of muscle gained. However, I do think they saw an increase in strength more in the creatine group than they did in the placebo group. So that is something we can bank for later, because that's something that's quite important to mention. But no change in muscle mass there. The third study, so they were looking again, guys and girls, uni age. There's a bit of a theme here. You might be wondering why they're all kind of university age. A lot of the time it's because when you're doing these studies, they're done at universities, and oftentimes it's quite easy to recruit people who are on your doorstep already. So a lot of the times these will be literally students on a sports science course or whatever, and they'll be recruiting these people directly there. And it's a lot easier than going out into the general public and finding all of these people. So these were, again, university aged people. They were already resistance training. I don't quite think it mentioned on this study how long they'd been resistance training for, or how much volume in total over or experience they'd had to accrue before they would be eligible, but they were already, we'll say, consistently resistance training, which is most likely. The creatine protocol here, they were using 0.1 grams of kilograms per kilogram of body weight a day, which again, same as the last study, 7 grams of creatine for someone who's 70 kilograms, just as a ballpark. And again, only on training days. So the training program for this, they were training again 4 times a week. This is looking very similar to the last study. So they're only taking creatine 4 times a week. It was a 6-week program, same as all of the other studies that we've covered so far. Upper and lower split, again, 3 sets, 6 to 10 reps per exercise. This study did stipulate that they asked participants to train to failure. So that is something that is different to the other studies. We didn't quite see that in the other studies. They didn't explain that. But we would assume and hope that the other studies had participants training at least somewhat close to failure, because we know that's really quite a crucial part of muscle growth. So this one did say they were going to failure with every set. Now, in terms of the results of this study, they found that the bicep thickness, so they looked at multiple different sites. Again, they were using ultrasound to measure the size of these muscles. Bicep thickness, tricep thickness, hamstring thickness showed no difference between creatine and placebo group. Again, they were using a placebo, and again, it's important to mention that both of these groups, I think, did make an improvement over the period of the 6 weeks, but it wasn't significantly different between the creatine group and the placebo group, apart from with their quadricep thickness. Now, this is a bit of a random finding, and it could just be down to chance. I'm not sure how many people they had on this study. If they had a relatively small amount, it might just be natural changes, but it was significant. So they ran some stats tests on it, and they found that quadricep thickness did improve in the creatine group. It improved by 10.8%, again at that one site they were measuring, compared to 5.7% in the non-creatine group, so the placebo group. So interesting there on the third study, it was a group of people who already were resistance training, but they did see a significant improvement in creatine, muscle in the creatine group, quadricep thickness only though. We'll get onto that later and what that might mean. The final study we're going to talk about was just in men. It was just in men. They were university aged again. These guys were untrained. So again, these hadn't been doing consistent resistance training. So we're seeing a bit of a mix on these studies. Some are recruiting people who are experienced with weights, and some are recruiting people who have never touched a weight or aren't seriously weight training at the moment. Their creatine protocol for this one, now this is unique compared to some of the other studies that we've talked about. So for this one, they actually did a loading protocol. Now, if you follow my TikTok, or you've seen some of my other videos, we talked a little bit about a loading protocol and what it might be good for, when you might need it, when you might not need it, but that's for another video. But for this one, they took 20 grams of creatine a day for the first 5 days of this program. Again, the program for this one was 8 weeks, so ever so slightly longer, but they did take the first week as kind of a loading phase, if you like, 20 grams a day. And then after that, they did a maintenance dose. So after that, they only took 5 grams a day, and it doesn't say that depending on body weight, that depended on body weight, which is again different to the other studies that we've gone over. It was just 5 grams a day for everyone. But interestingly, this is the only study that explicitly mentions they took the creatine every single day. So not just on training days, they were taking this every day, and they did a loading protocol. And the training program was longer. So bear all those things in mind here. Training program 8 weeks, 4 sets of 10 to 12 repetitions. Uniquely though, this study was only training the biceps. So very much a bro study design here, in that they were only hitting biceps. They didn't do any lower body, no other upper body exercises, just biceps for this one. And they measured bicep thickness. Obviously, they're not going to measure any other muscle in the body, but they were looking at bicep thickness again through ultrasound. And they found again that the placebo group underperformed compared to the creatine group. So the creatine group, the bicep thickness, again at that specific area they were measuring, improved by 17%, whereas the non-creatine group, the placebo group, improved by just 9%. So that's four studies there that we've covered. Now, obviously there are more studies out there, but as I've mentioned at the start, those are the ones I wanted to focus on for those key reasons why I think they might be more applicable. And so we're going to go into some kind of take-home points now. So what do I think about those, and what do I think that means for you when it comes to trying to gain muscle from creatine, and can you expect to gain muscle from creatine, essentially? So first of all, I think what we've learned from that is if you're new, and you can go back and kind of look at when we talked about those studies in untrained people. When you're young, when you're new to the gym, creatine will probably help you build more muscle than not. If you're not taking creatine, you have 2 people, someone's taking creatine, someone's not taking creatine, they're both new to the gym, they're both young, you're probably going to find the person who takes the creatine is going to build more muscle. Now, how much muscle are they going to build? Well, we're looking at the results of these studies. It's difficult to answer that question, but I'm going to attempt to, because that might be, I'm imagining the reason you watched this video is to find out the answer to that question. It's important to note that the measurements that these studies use are very much clinical measurements. So they're not the kind of measurements that we would necessarily look at if we are just trying to build muscle for aesthetic purposes. That might be more about, actual arm width. So we might look at, using a tape measure to measure around the arm, whereas they're very much looking at clinically, how much has the muscle grown through ultrasound measurements. So important to mention that ultrasound measurement doesn't take into account the whole appearance of the muscle. So when we say, they saw a 17% increase in bicep muscle thickness, that isn't a visual improvement of 17%, because the bicep is one element of the overall arm area. You've got the tricep, which makes up around 2/3 of the appearance of your arm in terms of muscle mass. There are other elements to take into account: fat mass, water weight, other elements that kind of will factor into how big your arms will look. So we have to think about those things as well when we look at what they were actually measuring. And thickness doesn't mean the total volume of the muscle, right? It's just the thickness at that specific area. It doesn't take into account the length of the muscle. So because of that, we had to do a little bit of prodding around to find an answer to this question: how much muscle would you gain? But if you're a newbie, taking into account the answers or the outcomes that we found in these studies, and with a little bit of help of ChatGPT in terms of converting what might be an average bicep size and the thickness into how much volume that would give you, we're looking at roughly, and take these with a pinch of salt, we're looking at roughly 146 grams of muscle, says ChatGPT, for if you're taking creatine over, let's say, a 6-week period, like these studies looked at, versus 70 grams of muscle gained in the non-creatine group. Now, I know you might be looking at those and thinking that's absolutely nothing. What is 150 grams of muscle? Am I ever going to even notice that I've put that much on? But we have to understand that I'm giving the example here of the bicep muscle and of what we've seen. There are obviously other muscles in the body, and if you're training a whole body approach and you're taking creatine, if you're gaining 146 grams of muscle in your bicep, in your single bicep, that is, think about how much muscle that will be on a whole body scale. That's going to be significant. And if I had to give an estimate, I would say that you would probably, from taking creatine, if you're a newbie, gain around about 1 to 2 kilograms of muscle from a 6-week training program, compared to if you were not taking creatine, you might gain much less than that, or well, not much less than that, but in the ballpark of around maybe a kilogram and a half, compared to maybe 2 kilograms of muscle. So that's rough estimates there. Let's talk about, though, if you are resistance training already, which I have a feeling a lot of the people watching this video are going to be in that ballpark, as opposed to the ballpark of never having trained before. Now, unfortunately, the answer to this question is, if you've been training already for at least, let's say, a year, the likelihood is you taking creatine is probably going to not do much more for your muscle mass. In fact, you probably won't gain any, depending on how long you've been training for, you're probably not going to gain much extra muscle mass from taking creatine at all. But from what we see in other studies, and again, this is for another video, and what we saw in one of these studies that I briefly mentioned, you will see improvements in strength. So even if you've been training for a little while, introducing creatine into your supplement routine is going to give you a pretty reliable increase in your muscle strength compared to if you didn't take creatine. It's just unlikely that you're going to see a gain in actual muscle mass as a result of taking creatine. Now, there might be a small gain in muscle mass here. The research is kind of unclear on that. In young, healthy individuals, we don't have a reliable way of saying, yes, if you're resistance training, you've been training for years, if you start taking creatine, you're going to gain this much muscle. We don't have the answer to that yet. I've given you an answer for those people who aren't trained yet, but you're very susceptible to muscle growth when you're in that early phase of training. So, unfortunately, you don't get the same benefits when you've been training for a little while. And again, how long that is, we don't know exactly, but I'm going to use the example of if you've been training consistently for at least a year, I would put you in that ballpark of the people I was just referring to there about not necessarily getting the benefits of creatine from a muscle mass perspective. So again, you might see minor improvements in muscle, but and I think it's important to say also that we saw in a couple of these studies, maybe loading creatine, especially taking creatine on non-training days, if you want to get the benefits of creatine, is probably quite important to do. So I think since some of these studies, we know that it's probably a better idea to take creatine consistently every day and not just on the days that you're training. And that's something that I harp on about on my TikTok as well. So that's something to take home as well. So really important to take creatine every day if you're thinking of taking it. I guess the final thing that I want to say is don't expect, if you've been training for a long time, don't expect creatine to give you more muscle mass, but do expect it to give you more strength, and as a result, potentially more muscle mass. If you can lift more weight, right? If you can perform, if you can put your muscle under more load, a higher amount of repetitions as a result of that, more sets as a result of that, you're going to see an increase in muscle mass. So indirectly, creatine might help you increase your muscle mass, but the most important benefit you're going to get is improving your strength. So most of the benefits of creatine are performance-based rather than actual muscle mass, giving you more muscle mass, giving you more of a kind of bigger look. So hopefully that's been useful for you all. I plan on doing these videos more often with a bit of a take-home point at the end to try and give you some more concrete answers on some of these questions, because I think that the landscape at the moment has been a bit muddied by a bunch of random influencers who don't know an awful lot about what they're talking about. So that's the plan going forward. Going to answer some of the hard-hitting questions, but pop some questions down in the comments if you want me to address them, and I'll have a look at the research, the latest research, and see where we're at with them. Thanks very much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you again in the next video.